Oh, no!
Los Angeles. Summer, 1984. The city was alive with heat, buzzing with neon, pulsing with late-night music and streetlights that flickered above restless sidewalks. But inside one small apartment, silence ruled, broken only by the humming of an old ceiling fan. Jenny Vin Cao, a 79-year-old grandmother, slept alone. She had lived through wars, hardship, and decades of life in the city, but she could never have prepared for the figure that stood in the shadows of her bedroom that night. A window left slightly open for air, a faint creak of the screen door, then the sound of footsteps. The intruder loomed over her, silent, patient. His eyes glimmered with something not human, something colder, darker. And then, in one sudden explosion of violence, Jenny Vin Cao became the first known victim of the man Los Angeles would come to know as the Night Stalker. By morning, her body would be discovered, stabbed, slashed, violated. The police who walked into that room said the scene was so horrific, it didn't just mark a crime. It marked the beginning of a reign of terror that would haunt California for over a year.
Welcome to the Crime Ledger, where every page reveals a mystery.
Before you dive in, write in the comments section where you're watching from right now, and if you are a lover of true crime stories, don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the bell icon, so you will never miss the next true crime stories.
At first, the murder of Jenny Vin Cao seemed like one of countless tragedies that touched a sprawling metropolis. Los Angeles was a city of millions, where violence was not uncommon. But something about this crime was different. The brutality. The randomness. At first, the murder of Jenny Vin Cao seemed like one of countless tragedies that touched a sprawling metropolis. Los Angeles was a city of millions, where violence was not uncommon. But something about this crime was different. The brutality. The randomness. The way the killer seemed to leave nothing behind except chaos and fear. Jenny had been stabbed repeatedly. Her throat slashed so deeply that investigators whispered it was more a statement than a murder. And when detectives looked closer, they found signs of sexual assault. This wasn't just a burglary gone wrong. It was deliberate, sadistic, and intimate. The press reported the crime, but the true horror wasn't yet understood. To neighbors, Jenny had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. To police, it was the work of someone who had killed before, or would kill again. What no one knew was that this faceless predator was just getting started. He had tasted blood, and now, he wanted more. Most killers have a type. They stalk women, or men. They choose young or old. They attack in familiar locations or specific times. But this man, the one who crept into homes in the dead of night, followed no rules that he killed the elderly and the young. He attacked women and men. He stole, he raped, he murdered, he mutilated. And that unpredictability made him even more dangerous. Over the next months, Los Angeles would begin to whisper stories of a figure who prowled neighborhoods after dark. A phantom slipping through open windows, creeping across carpets while families slept. He became a legend in real time, and with each new killing, the myth grew darker, the city more afraid. But back then, after Jenny's murder, no one had a name for him. No one had a face. Only the growing certainty that something evil was moving through the city. To understand the terror, you have to know the people it touched. Jenny Vin Cao was not wealthy. She was not famous. She was a grandmother who lived in a modest apartment, close to her family. She was described as kind, devout, and loving. Her life was quiet. Safe. Until it wasn't. And that's what made her death so chilling. This wasn't a gang dispute. It wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a lover's quarrel or a mob hit. It was random. It was meaningless. And it was exactly the kind of crime that makes an entire city shiver, because if it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. Months passed. And then, the killings began again. March 1985. Whittier, California. A young woman named Dale Okazaki was sitting in her kitchen, late at night, when the same figure appeared. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He simply raised a gun and fired. Dale died instantly. Her roommate, Maria Hernandez, heard the noise and came face to face with the killer. In a rare stroke of luck, she survived, the bullet striking her keys, deflecting the shot. She ran. She lived. She became one of the first people to look into the eyes of the Night Stalker and survive to tell the tale. That same night, just hours later, another victim fell. Tsai Yenyu, a 30-year-old woman, was dragged from her car and shot to death. 2 murders, 1 attempted. Same night. Same killer. The city was beginning to see the pattern, or rather, the lack of one. By spring of 1985, Los Angeles had transformed. People nailed their windows shut despite the sweltering heat. Hardware stores sold out of locks, bars, and guard dogs. Neighborhood watch groups patrolled streets, desperate for any sign of the man newspapers were calling the Valley Intruder. The stories circulated like wildfire. A tall, thin man with bad teeth and dark eyes. A man who whispered satanic prayers as he attacked. A man who seemed to vanish into the night, leaving nothing but blood and terror behind. And the most terrifying part? He could be anywhere. He didn't just attack in one district. He moved like a phantom across counties, Whittier, Monterey Park, Arcadia. No home was safe. At first, police had almost nothing to go on. But one detail began to emerge. At multiple crime scenes, detectives noticed the same shoe print, left in dirt, on carpets, even on victims' bedding. It was a distinctive obvious sneaker, size 11.5. Only a single pair had been sold in Los Angeles. Whoever this killer was, he wasn't careful. He was arrogant. And that arrogance would, eventually, become his downfall. But for now, the shoe was only a whisper of hope in a storm of chaos. The brutality escalated. Victims were raped, beaten, stabbed, strangled, shot. Survivors described eyes that looked almost dead, lifeless, yet filled with hatred. He demanded victims swear to Satan as he attacked, cementing his image not just as a killer, but as something darker. The media seized on the satanic whispers. Headlines screamed of ritual murders, devil worship, a demonic intruder stalking the city. Fear turned into hysteria. Every creak of a floorboard at night made families jolt awake. Every shadow on a wall seemed to carry his face. And the killer fed on that fear. By the summer of 1985, Los Angeles was paralyzed. The police were chasing a ghost. The people were locking themselves inside cages of their own making. And the killer, he was only getting bolder. He began leaving messages. Telling survivors, tell them the Night Stalker was here. The name stuck. The Night Stalker. And as the summer nights grew hotter, the attacks more brazen, the city was left with a single terrifying question. Who was he, and how long before he struck again? The summer of 1985 in Los Angeles was unlike any other. The days blazed with heat, the nights simmered with dread. Families who once enjoyed sleeping with their windows open found themselves suffocating in locked, barricaded homes. But even locked doors weren't enough. Because the Night Stalker didn't care about locks. He didn't care about alarms. He didn't care about people. He cared about chaos. He cared about control. He cared about pain. And as June turned into July, he made Los Angeles his hunting ground. What made Richard Ramirez so terrifying wasn't just the violence of his crimes. It was the unpredictability. Most serial killers leave a pattern. They pick certain victims, certain neighborhoods, certain methods. Ramirez? He chose anyone. Anywhere. Anytime. He murdered a 41-year-old man in his sleep, then attacked the man's wife, forcing her to swear to Satan as he assaulted her. He killed an elderly couple, stabbing them relentlessly before scrawling pentagrams across their walls. He shot a young man dead in his bed, then raped the man's fiancée beside his lifeless body. No one was safe. And worse, no one could predict who would be next. The stories spread like wildfire. The city was in a grip of hysteria. Parents refused to let their children out at night. Hardware stores couldn't keep padlocks in stock. Gun sales skyrocketed. Every night, neighborhoods turned into armed camps. Groups of men patrolled their blocks with baseball bats, flashlights, and rifles. Women double-bolted their doors. Some families even slept in shifts, too afraid to all fall asleep at once. And yet, despite the vigilance, the killings continued. The Night Stalker was like a phantom. He could be anywhere. He left behind no warning, no reason, no mercy. It wasn't just the brutality of the crimes, it was the ritualistic horror he left behind. Ramirez often forced his victims to swear to Satan as he attacked them. At some crime scenes, he drew pentagrams. Survivors recalled him chanting demonic prayers, his voice low, guttural, terrifying. To a city already nervous, the whispers of Satanism made the fear almost unbearable. Newspapers ran with headlines, "Satanic Killer Stalks Los Angeles." The Night Stalker wasn't just a murderer, he was painted as something otherworldly. A demon. A beast. A shadow walking in human form. And Ramirez loved it. He wanted the city to fear not just his body, but his soul. Behind the scenes, police were unraveling. Detectives from the Los Angeles Police Department and the Sheriff's Department were chasing leads, but Ramirez moved too quickly, too randomly. One night he struck in Arcadia. The next in Monterey Park. Then across counties in San Francisco. The lack of pattern drove investigators mad. They had the obvious shoe print. They had vague eyewitness descriptions, a tall, thin man, bad teeth, dark hair. But there was no name. No suspect. And as each new murder landed on their desks, the pressure mounted. The media began criticizing the police. Politicians demanded answers. The public wanted blood. But Ramirez was always one step ahead. To truly understand the terror, you have to hear from the survivors. One young woman recalled waking in the dead of night to the sound of glass shattering. She opened her eyes to find a gaunt man standing in her doorway, eyes glinting like a predator's. He raised a gun, shot her fiancé where he lay, and then turned on her. Another survivor, a child, was abducted from her bedroom in the middle of the night. She was assaulted, then released, Ramirez disappearing into the dark as though he had never existed. These survivors described not just violence, but a presence. They spoke of his eyes, dead, hollow, but filled with a hatred that seemed inhuman. And yet, each time they described him, detectives came no closer to stopping him. By July, Los Angeles was in full lockdown. The Night Stalker wasn't just a story anymore. He was a nightmare everyone lived with. Families turned their homes into fortresses. Some nailed their windows shut permanently, sacrificing air for safety. Others slept with shotguns by their beds. Churches overflowed with people praying for protection. The city was suffocating under fear. And still, Ramirez prowled. He struck one night in Glendale, the next in Arcadia. He beat, shot, stabbed, and raped with impunity. His violence escalated with each crime, as though he was feeding off the fear he created. And the media fed the frenzy. Each headline, each whisper of Satanism, each gruesome detail, it made him more powerful. The Night Stalker wasn't just killing people. He was killing the soul of a city. The investigation was chaos. At one point, police chased down dozens of tips about suspicious men with bad teeth. Another time, they thought they had their suspect cornered, only to realize it was the wrong man. The pressure was unbearable. Detectives clashed with each other. The LAPD and Sheriff's Department argued over jurisdiction. Every new murder brought another round of finger-pointing and desperation. And all the while, Ramirez was out there. Watching the news. Reading the papers. Smiling at his growing infamy. He was. Or so he thought. It was in July of 1985 that detectives found their first real crack in the case. At yet another brutal crime scene, just as they were beginning to despair, they saw it again, clearer this time. The obvious shoe print. The same tread. The same size. It was their only solid clue. Their only thread. And as one detective stared at the print, he whispered the words that would echo through the investigation. "This is the devil's footprint." The hunt was on. The crime scene was quiet, except for the slow clicks of cameras. Police officers moved carefully, their gloves stained with the red smears of another brutal night. On the carpet, right next to the victim's bed, was a perfect imprint. A sneaker print. Investigators crouched down, studying it like a relic. Size 11.5. Avia brand. Rare. Unique. For weeks, months even, they had been chasing shadows. But here, finally, was something solid. Something the Night Stalker couldn't erase. The devil had left his footprint. As detectives pored over their files, the shoe print began to appear again and again. On a blood-soaked driveway in Arcadia. On a windowsill in Monterey Park. Stamped into dirt outside a Glendale home. The same tread. The same size. The same killer. There was no denying it now, this wasn't a series of isolated murders. This was one man, leaving a trail of bodies across California. And with each discovery, the legend grew darker. The newspapers called him the walk-in killer. Others whispered the Valley Intruder. But on the streets, the name had already changed. The Night Stalker. One of the most haunting parts of the case came not from the dead, but from the living, the survivors who had stared into Ramirez's eyes and lived to tell the tale. Maria Hernandez, who had miraculously survived when his bullet ricocheted off her car keys, described his face as lifeless. He looked empty. But not human empty. Dark. Like something was inside him that shouldn't be. Children he abducted and released spoke of whispered threats, of rituals, of being forced to pray to Satan. Another survivor recounted how he stood over her bed and hissed, "Swear to Satan you won't scream." The chilling consistency of his words, his obsession with the devil, cemented his image as not just a killer, but a monster cloaked in darkness. What emerged on paper was chilling. A narrow face. Hollow cheeks. Wild hair. Eyes that looked dead. When the sketch hit the news, panic erupted. Los Angeles wasn't just imagining a monster anymore, they could see him. They could picture him at their window. But Ramirez, he was watching too. And he knew time was running out. At crime scenes, detectives found more than just shoe prints. Pentagrams scrawled on walls. Symbols carved into bodies. Whispers of satanic ritual echoed through the investigation. Detectives were torn. Some thought the symbols were taunts, meant to terrify. Others wondered if Ramirez truly believed he was serving the devil. One officer described walking into a blood-splattered home and seeing the pentagram. He said, it felt like stepping into hell itself. Whether Ramirez believed it or not, one thing was certain, it was working. The fear was spreading like a plague. The pressure was crushing. Detectives were working around the clock. Sleep-deprived, burned out, chasing tip after tip that went nowhere. One day it was a drifter spotted near a bus stop. The next it was a satanic cult rumor. Each lead fizzled into nothing. The LAPD and the Sheriff's Department clashed bitterly, each accusing the other of incompetence. Politicians demanded answers. The public demanded blood. And the killings didn't stop. Every time the police thought they were closing in, Ramirez struck again, laughing at them, mocking them, leaving his obvious footprint like a cruel joke. Then, a break. In one crime scene, detectives discovered a fingerprint, smudged, partial, but enough. After weeks of painstaking analysis, they matched it. The name was chilling. Richard Ramirez. Born in El Paso, Texas. Petty thief, drifter, drug addict. Already on the radar for smaller crimes. And now, identified as the Night Stalker. When police released his mugshot to the public, the city erupted. His face was everywhere, on TV, on newspapers, plastered across Los Angeles. For the first time, the Phantom had a name. For the first time, the people knew who haunted their nights. When Ramirez saw his own face on the front page, he panicked. He fled Los Angeles, taking a Greyhound bus to Arizona. But the walls were closing in. The city was no longer afraid in silence, they were angry. And the Night Stalker was about to learn what happens when a city fights back. Detectives sharpened their focus. The press exploded with stories. And on the streets, people armed themselves not just for protection, but for revenge. The predator had become prey. And within weeks, the hunt for Richard Ramirez would turn from a police investigation into something far more dangerous, a manhunt fueled by rage. By the summer of 1985, Los Angeles was no longer just afraid. It was seething. For months, Richard Ramirez had turned the city into his personal playground. He crept into bedrooms, slaughtered families, defiled children, and vanished before dawn. But now, his face was everywhere. His mugshot plastered on newspapers. His name whispered on radio stations. His description passed from neighbor to neighbor. The Phantom had become flesh. And the city was ready to hunt him. Even as his face stared back at him from storefronts, Ramirez couldn't stop. He stole cars, broke into homes, and left carnage behind. One night, he shot a man in San Francisco, marking his first kill outside of Los Angeles. On the wall, he scrawled a pentagram, taunting police. The press branded him not just as a killer, but as a symbol of evil itself. Every article, every whisper of satanic ritual, every survivor's testimony made the fear deeper, and Ramirez loved it. But with each crime, he also grew more reckless. He left more clues. He drew more attention. The noose was tightening. Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. The Los Angeles Police Department and the Sheriff's Department were at war over jurisdiction. Some detectives argued Ramirez was their case. Others claimed they had the evidence. San Francisco's police entered the fight when he struck in their city. The rivalry slowed the investigation. Reports weren't shared. Leads were delayed. And while law enforcement argued, Ramirez was still out there, laughing. One officer later admitted, it felt like he was always 2 steps ahead. Like he was watching us fight while he planned his next kill. But the people of Los Angeles weren't waiting anymore. Vigilante groups formed in nearly every neighborhood. Men patrolled with baseball bats, women carried pistols in their purses, families reinforced their doors with steel. One homeowner described sleeping in shifts. My wife stayed awake with a gun while I slept, then I'd take over until dawn. We lived like prisoners. Ramirez had intended to create fear. What he hadn't expected was that the city's fear would turn to fury. The predator had become prey, and Los Angeles was sharpening its claws. By late August, Ramirez was unraveling. He stole a car, leaving fingerprints inside. He attempted another attack, but the victim fought back, giving police a description of his weapon. His once invisible shadow was now glaring under the spotlight of an enraged city. Finally, on August 30th, police released his name and photograph to the public. Richard Ramirez. 25 years old. Wanted for murder, rape, burglary, and torture. His time was running out. On August 31st, 1985, Ramirez boarded a Greyhound bus to Tucson, Arizona. But by the time he returned to Los Angeles, everything had changed. His face was on every front page. His name was on every television broadcast. Everyone was watching for him. When he stepped off the bus, he saw people whispering, pointing. For the first time, Richard Ramirez felt fear. He ducked into stores, scanning the headlines. His mugshot stared back from every newspaper rack. He tried to steal a car, but the owner shouted. A crowd gathered. Someone yelled. That's him. That's the Night Stalker. And then chaos erupted. Men chased him down the street. Neighbors poured from their houses. Someone grabbed a pipe. Another swung a hammer. The hunted had become cornered prey. Ramirez sprinted through alleys, desperate, wild-eyed, but there was nowhere to go. Every face when the mob finally caught him, they beat him mercilessly. By the time police arrived, Richard Ramirez, the monster who had terrorized California, was bloodied, broken, and begging for his life. But this was not the end. Because the capture of Richard Ramirez was only the beginning of another nightmare. The trial. The spectacle. The moment the world would see evil up close. And in the courtroom, Ramirez would prove that his reign of terror wasn't over, it was only changing shape. August 31st, 1985. A hot Saturday morning. In East Los Angeles, the air vibrated with the sound of shouting. A man was running through the streets, wild-eyed, blood streaming down his face. Richard Ramirez. He wasn't stalking victims anymore. He was being hunted. The neighborhood had turned on him. Men chased him with pipes and wrenches. Mothers screamed for justice. A mob closed in. Someone swung a metal bar, cracking his skull. Others pinned him down, fists raining onto his body. By the time police sirens wailed through the streets, the Night Stalker was curled on the asphalt, beaten and broken, begging for his life. The monster was caged. When word spread that Ramirez had been captured, Los Angeles erupted. Strangers hugged each other on sidewalks. Churches rang their bells. Neighbors wept openly. For the first time in over a year, families slept with their windows open. The air felt lighter. The fear that had gripped an entire metropolis finally loosened its chokehold. Ramirez was led away in handcuffs, his face swollen, his body bruised. To many, it wasn't enough. They wanted him to suffer like his victims. But at least he was caught. At least he would never walk free again. Or so they thought. Even in custody, Ramirez unsettled those around him. Detectives described him as calm, almost amused. He smirked when charges were read. He laughed when officers spoke of his victims. When asked why he killed, he shrugged. When asked about Satan, his eyes lit up. One officer later said, "He wanted us to think he wasn't human." And in a way, it worked. There was nothing behind those eyes. The press exploded. Every newspaper ran with his mugshot. Every TV station dissected his crimes. Talk shows debated whether Ramirez was insane, satanic, or simply evil. Crowds gathered outside courthouses, waving signs, demanding justice. Victims' families gave heartbreaking interviews. Survivors relived their trauma for millions to hear. And Ramirez? He reveled in it. He became a celebrity of horror. Fans sent letters, photographs, even love notes to the jail where he was held. Some called him sexy. Others described him as mysterious. The same man who raped, tortured, and murdered had become an icon of twisted fascination. When Ramirez made his first court appearance, the world saw something chilling. He walked into the courtroom in shackles, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, his face smug. And then, as the crowd gasped, he raised his hand, palm open, revealing a pentagram scrawled across it. "Satan," he whispered. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't fear. It was theater. The Night Stalker was no longer just a killer. He was a performer, and the courtroom was his stage. For the families of his victims, every hearing was torture. They sat in the gallery, watching the man who had destroyed their lives smirk at the cameras. They listened as details of the crimes were read aloud, each stab wound, each whispered threat, each satanic ritual. Some wept. Some stared daggers at him. Some prayed. One survivor said later, "Every time he looked at me, it felt like he was killing me all over again." The city had expected a monster in chains. What they got was worse, a man who enjoyed being the monster. Every smirk, every satanic gesture, every whisper into the microphones made it clear, Richard Ramirez wasn't ashamed of what he had done. He was proud. And the public couldn't look away. The courtroom had become a circus. Reporters swarmed the steps. True crime fanatics fought for seats inside. And Ramirez basked in it, his dark aura growing stronger with every headline. But this was only the beginning. The real test was yet to come. The trial of Richard Ramirez would become one of the most infamous in American history, a battle of testimony, evidence, and sheer horror that would drag on for years. And when the verdict finally came, it wouldn't just seal Ramirez's fate. It would force the world to stare into the face of evil, and decide what justice truly meant. September 1985. The courthouse in Los Angeles was a fortress. Police lined the steps, reporters swarmed the sidewalks, and television cameras rolled endlessly. Inside, a crowd packed into the gallery, clutching notebooks, microphones, and rosaries. They weren't there for a movie premiere or a celebrity scandal. They were there for a trial. The trial of Richard Ramirez. The Night Stalker. And it would become one of the most chilling spectacles in American legal history. When Ramirez entered the courtroom, shackled and flanked by deputies, the room fell silent. He wore dark sunglasses, his hair long and unkempt, his mouth twisted into a smirk. Across his palm, in thick black ink, was a pentagram. He raised it high for the cameras to see. And then, with a voice both calm and defiant, he said the word that froze the courtroom. "Hail Satan." Gasps filled the air. Some wept. Others prayed. But Ramirez only smiled wider. For him, the trial wasn't about justice. It was a stage. The proceedings quickly spiraled into chaos. On one side of the courtroom sat the families of victims, their faces carved with grief and rage. Survivors, trembling but determined, prepared to relive their nightmares in front of strangers. On the other side sat Ramirez, smirking, laughing, sometimes even winking at his so-called fans. Yes, fans. Women wrote letters. Some mailed him photographs. A few even attended hearings, staring at him with adoration, as if he were a rock star instead of a sadistic killer. The press devoured every detail. Ramirez wasn't just on trial. He was a media phenomenon. But behind the circus lay the horror. One by one, survivors took the stand. Their voices cracked as they described waking in the night to find Ramirez in their bedrooms. A woman described being forced at gunpoint to swear to Satan before she was raped. Another recounted the moment she watched her husband shot dead beside her. Children testified about being abducted, assaulted, and left trembling in the dark. The courtroom wept with them. But Ramirez? He leaned back in his chair, smiling. Sometimes laughing. As if their pain was entertainment. The prosecution presented mountains of evidence. The obvious shoe print, linking crime scenes across counties. Fingerprints from stolen cars. Stolen jewelry found in his possession. Ballistic matches from his .22 caliber revolver. Piece by piece, they built the case. It wasn't just circumstantial. It was undeniable. Ramirez, the drifter with rotten teeth and cold eyes, was the Night Stalker. Yet, throughout the trial, Ramirez seemed unfazed. He often arrived late, forcing delays. He shouted obscenities at the judge. At one point, he threatened to kill a juror. Deputies whispered about his disturbing aura. Some believed he had followers outside the courtroom who might act in his name. One juror, terrified by threats, was dismissed after refusing to continue. The tension inside the courthouse was electric. Every glance, every word, every laugh from Ramirez felt like a knife to the survivors and families. And always, there was Satan. Pentagrams on his palm. Satanic salutes to the cameras. Whispers of rituals and dark prayers. Ramirez wasn't just defending himself against charges. He was performing for fear. He wanted to be remembered not just as a murderer, but as a disciple of darkness. And in some twisted way, it worked. The headlines, the hysteria, the endless speculation, Ramirez had turned his crimes into legend. For the families, each day was agony. A mother sobbed as the jury was shown photographs of her murdered child. A father trembled with rage, staring at Ramirez's smirk as if willing him to burn on the spot. A survivor, barely holding herself together, whispered after testifying, "He's not human." The pain was raw. The grief was unbearable. And the longer the trial stretched, the more surreal it all felt. The courtroom had become not a place of justice, but a theater of horror. The trial dragged on for months, then years. Delays. Motions. Outbursts. Appeals. It became one of the longest and most expensive trials in California history. By the time it approached its conclusion, the world had seen every angle of Ramirez, the killer, the cult figure, the monster, the man. And the jury had seen enough. On September 20, 1989, after years of testimony, mountains of evidence, and unimaginable suffering, the jury filed back into the courtroom. Reporters leaned forward. Families clutched hands. Survivors held their breath. Richard Ramirez sat back in his chair, sunglasses on, smirking. The foreman rose. The verdict was ready. September 20, 1989. For years after his capture, the courtroom was silent. Reporters filled every seat, pens trembling over paper. Families of victims held hands, their faces pale with anticipation. The courtroom was silent. Reporters filled every seat, pens trembling over paper. Families of victims held hands, their faces pale with anticipation. Richard Ramirez sat slouched in his chair, sunglasses hiding his eyes, his lips curled into a smirk. The jury foreman stood. Papers rustled. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then came the words that broke the silence. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Ramirez, guilty." One by one, the charges rolled out. Guilty of 13 counts of murder. Guilty of 11 sexual assaults. Guilty of 5 attempted murders. Guilty of 14 burglaries. Each word was a hammer. Each verdict a nail in his coffin. Families wept. Survivors sobbed. Reporters scribbled furiously. And Ramirez? He grinned. For the families, the guilty verdict was both a relief and a wound reopened. Some clutched each other, whispering prayers of thanks. Others wept uncontrollably, knowing no verdict could bring their loved ones back. A mother of one victim said quietly, "He can never hurt anyone again. That's all that matters." But there was no joy, only exhaustion, grief, and the faintest glimmer of justice. Weeks later, the sentencing phase began. The prosecution demanded death. They described Ramirez as a predator who had inflicted unspeakable cruelty. A monster beyond redemption. The defense tried to argue mental illness, a troubled childhood, drug addiction. But the jury had already seen too much. On November 7, 1989, the sentence was read. Death. Ramirez was to be executed in California's gas chamber. The families gasped. Some cried tears of relief. Others simply stared at him, wishing death could come sooner. And then came the moment the world would never forget. As deputies moved to escort him away, Richard Ramirez leaned toward the microphones. His voice was calm. Almost cheerful. Big deal. Death always comes with the territory. See you in Disneyland. The courtroom froze. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was mockery. Ramirez had turned even his death sentence into a performance. But the sentence didn't bring closure. California's death row was notorious for its delays. Appeals, legal battles, and endless red tape meant Ramirez wouldn't face the gas chamber anytime soon. Instead, he was locked inside San Quentin prison, alive, breathing, smirking, while his victims lay buried. And somehow, his infamy grew. Letters poured in. Women sent love notes. Some even proposed marriage. Ramirez became a cult figure, a dark celebrity of horror. The ledger of terror wasn't closed. It was still being written, line by line, headline by headline. For the families, the trial's end wasn't an end at all. Every anniversary, every appeal, every newspaper article reopened the wound. Survivors struggled with nightmares. Parents stared at empty chairs. Children grew up without mothers, fathers, siblings. Ramirez had stolen more than lives. He had stolen peace. And his smirk, even behind bars, made sure they never forgot. Richard Ramirez had been convicted. He had been sentenced to die. But in the darkness of San Quentin, the Night Stalker still thrived. He wrote letters. He courted admirers. He strutted through the prison yard as if still untouchable. He wasn't gone. He wasn't silenced. Not yet. And in the years to come, his shadow would stretch even further, until his final day came, not in a gas chamber, but in a hospital bed. The iron gates slammed shut behind him. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, was now inmate number C073837 at San Quentin State Prison. Convicted of 13 murders, sentenced to die in the gas chamber. For the families of his victims, it should have been the end. But for Ramirez, it was just another stage. Inside San Quentin, Ramirez thrived in the shadows. He strutted across the yard with the same smug grin he wore in court. He soaked in the attention, the whispers of fear even from hardened convicts. And outside the prison walls, the letters poured in. Women wrote him every day. Some sent photographs, others sent promises of eternal love. He replied with crude jokes, satanic symbols, and chilling words of affection. One woman even married him behind bars. To her, he wasn't a murderer. He was a misunderstood icon. For Ramirez, it was proof of what he had always wanted, power. Even locked in a cell, he could still control people. Still inspire fear. Still seduce the weak. Ramirez's cult-like following horrified the public. How could anyone love a man who had raped, tortured, and murdered indiscriminately? How could anyone romanticize the Night Stalker? Yet, they did. True crime enthusiasts argued over his motives. Some called him a monster. Others called him a victim of his childhood. A few called him brilliant. The media couldn't stay away. His name appeared in books, documentaries, endless headlines. Each time, his smirk appeared on screen, daring the world to forget. And in San Quentin, Ramirez smiled. His ledger of terror was still being written. For the families, Ramirez's life on death row was a cruel reminder. Every year he lived was another year their loved ones remained in the ground. Every appeal he filed was another wound reopened. Every interview he gave was another twist of the knife. Some parents grew old waiting for his execution. Some died before seeing justice. Survivors carried the weight of his crimes into their own families, haunted by nightmares they could never shake. Justice had come in name, but not in reality. After more than 2 decades on death row, the Night Stalker's reign finally ended. But not with the hiss of lethal gas. Not with the justice his victims' families had prayed for. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died in a hospital, the victim not of execution, but of cancer. He was 53 years old. His death was quiet, unceremonious. But for the families, it was one final insult. After decades of waiting for justice, Ramirez had escaped it once again, slipping away not by law, but by disease. And yet, even in death, Ramirez's shadow lingers. Documentaries, books, podcasts, films, his story is retold again and again. His face, that hollow-eyed smirk, has become a symbol of evil itself. He wanted to be remembered. And he was. But not as a man. Not even as a killer. As something darker. A reminder that monsters don't just hide in the woods or the myths of old. Sometimes they live next door. Sometimes they ride the same bus. Sometimes they smile at you in passing. Richard Ramirez wasn't born a demon. He was a man. A man who chose to become one. And that's what makes him so terrifying. Today, Los Angeles remembers the summer of 1985 as the summer of fear. The nights when people nailed their windows shut. The days when neighbors patrolled with bats and rifles. The mornings when families woke to find police tape strung across a street. The Night Stalker is dead. But the terror he inspired lives on. Because evil doesn't end when the body dies. It lingers, in memories, in nightmares, in the silence of dark bedrooms. Richard Ramirez wrote his ledger of terror in blood. And though he is gone, the pages remain, reminding us that the scariest monsters are not the ones we imagine, but the ones who walk among us. Thanks for watching. Like, share and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories told like never before.